Hi, I'm Paul Sunnucks. I'd like to tell you about a reason why national parks are very important that many people might not have thought about. I've lived in Oakley for nearly 25 years. During most of that time, I've been at Monash University where I do teaching and research in conservation biology. Most people appreciate that we live in a time when nature is under threat from human actions. In case you're not familiar with it, I'd like to introduce you to the Living Planet Index, which is a simple index that gives some sense of how we're tracking with biodiversity on the planet. This index was invented in the 1970s and is driven by a number of organisations who collect data from around the world monitoring animal populations. The index began with a value of 1, from which point it could have gone up or down. There's me in 1970 when the index started on the famous rocks at Stonehenge. In the intervening 40 years, we've done quite a good job of looking after Stonehenge. You're no longer allowed to sit on the rocks. We've done a much less good job of looking after biodiversity because the Living Planet Index fell by over 50% in the 40-year period. Such population declines are very often driven by habitat loss, fragmentation and degradation. Populations become small and isolated, and this increases their proneness to extinction. Victoria in the 1800s looked something like this, and by 2000 it looked something like this. As habitat is lost, populations become small and isolated, and they accumulate 3 genetic problems that increase their extinction risk. First of these is inbreeding, having closely related parents. Inbreeding shortens lifespans and reduces reproduction. An example is the helmeted honeyeater, a Victorian bird. The least inbred helmeted honeyeaters can expect something like 27 offspring in a lifetime, but the most inbred can expect about 10% as many. Loss of genetic variation also removes useful attributes. This Victorian grassland daisy loses the ability to pollinate as it loses genetic variation. And populations also are able to respond to climate change and other threats only if they have sufficient genetic variation, which they get from having large and connected populations. The good news is that we know how to do genetic management really successfully. Over about 30 years, we've accumulated and tested procedures, and they work really, really well. And these are some Victorian examples of species for which this has been applied. Continuing with the helmeted honeyeater as an example, this Victorian bird had the same problem as a lot of wildlife, that it lost a huge proportion of its habitat, and in fact only 50 individuals remained of this bird in the entire world. Intensive conservation management actions of all sorts from a lot of different agencies and individuals have been successful in increasing the population size, part of that being a genetic management breeding program run by Zoos Victoria. The genetic diversity breeding has been really effective, and in 2019 birds were released into the last natural population at Yellingbo Nature Conservation Reserve. And subsequently it was possible to set up a second population, this time in Yarra Ranges National Park, where there was some suitable habitat, even though this is outside the natural range of the helmeted honeyeater. So this is good news, but prevention would be so much better than cure. It'll be far more efficient and cost effective to avoid problems in the first place rather than fixing them afterwards. So, for example, the leadbeater's possum, needs large and connected populations in high quality forest that contains denning sites in hollows in trees and good feeding habitat. This is yet another reason to love our national parks. In fact, information from around the world shows that protecting nature is an amazingly good investment. Just one example, if we take a target from the Convention for Biological Diversity of managing and protecting 17% of lands and inland waters, estimated global cost of that is something like $76 billion a year. But the benefit is something like $2 to $6 trillion a year. That is a 25 to 100-fold return on investment. Is $76 billion a lot of money? Obviously, it's a question of perspective and priorities. So $76 billion to save biodiversity. In the same year to which that estimate applied, the world spent $470 billion on soft drinks sales. So we have to love our national parks for providing large connected areas for wildlife to thrive. We also have to love them for bringing us hope. We need national parks.